Hello, so today I'm going to present my Hedonism is Morality project. So, as some context, um, my project focuses on ethical hedonism or normative hedonism rather than psychological hedonism. And the difference is that ethical hedonism is the moral philosophy that pleasure is the highest intrinsic good and ultimate goal, while psychological hedonism kind of focuses more on the human behavior side and argues that the motivation of all human behavior is pleasure and pain. But while ethical hedonism is more of a moral account that pleasure is the highest good, intrinsic good. And this falls under the topic of normative ethics. So the question that my project will essentially answer is what makes anything morally right or wrong in the first place, right? So when we look at any action, um, that we deem to be moral or immoral, what kind of accounts for that, right? And so many criticists of the hedonist position argue that pleasure and pain are not the sole intrinsic goods of the universe, and so they are not the things that matter morally, and may answer this question with values other than pleasure and pain. And I'll get into that. I'll be basically defending ethical hedonism and supporting the argument that pleasure and pain are indeed the sole necessary conditions for so morality. Here is briefly some other philosophers' answers. So Kant kind of posited that an action is moral or moral based off of rational thought, and Aristotle um, focus more on virtuous character, and then social contract theorists like Hobbes argued that it's more of a subjective kind of agreement between the individuals that make an action immoral. And so here's my toy argument. And kind of goes through three sections, right? I first say that every moral judgment you have ever made traces back to someone being hurt or helped. Out for examples, right? When you say slavery is wrong, you mean people suffered. When you say a generous act is good, it means someone's life felt better because of it. So this raises the question: what is actually doing more work, and what makes anything morally right or wrong in the first place? Like I said before, and I answer this with it is the conscious experience of pleasure and pain that makes anything morally right or wrong. And I offer examples, right? That's because number one, conscious needs to be established, right? You can burn a forest, destroy a painting, or break a promise or rock, but none of these are genuine moral wrongs because nothing is conscious. So that condition applies first. And once consciousness is established, um, pleasure and pain are what that moral consideration actually regards. So, therefore, I argue that pleasure and pain are the sole necessary conditions for morality, and that everything else, other values such as virtue, consent, freedom, are not actually the main conditions, but rather play instrumental roles in the overall experience of conscious pleasure or pain. So here's my argument map. Um, my main claim is here: conscious experience of pleasure and pain are the sole necessary conditions for morality. And we can see my main claim is supported by a triplet co-premise, which is one, conscious being can be morally wrong or benefited. Two, harm is just suffering, benefit is just pleasure. Three, everything derives its moral weight from pleasure and pain. And I explain each with examples from various papers. Um, and so, how these work together is once consciousness is established, and we also establish that harm and pleasure is just suffering, harm is just suffering, and benefit is just pleasure, then every action will be based off of the conscious experience of pleasure and pain. And my third core premise just established that everything else derives its moral weight from pleasure and pain. Um, so that's my argument. Right. So here are the objections, and the main objection is the experience machine, which we talked about in class, and as well as the sadistic crowd. And I'll just kind of go through the scenario. So the experience machine is a scenario where a scientist offers a perfectly simulated life of pleasure, and it if pleasure is all that matter, it says this objection says that you should plug in. but almost everyone refuses because of the sense of reality. And this suggests that we value authenticity and reality beyond feeling, and this is supposed to defeat the hedonist argument, that pleasure and pain are the sole necessary good for morality. And objection two is the sadistic crowd. It gives you a scenario where you have 1,000 people that take pleasure in humiliating one person, and that kind of combined pleasure seems to outweigh that innocent person's pain. And this shows that the justice system is immoral for hedonistic thought, and that is another objection. So how I respond to these objections are, so for number one, right, I believe that the refusal to plug in itself is in fact a hedonic response, and this doesn't defeat the argument, because I argue that the reason why it's hedonic response is because knowing you are choosing a simulation produces real anxiety. And so genuine relationships and achievements produce richer, more stable pleasure than simulated ones, even if you didn't know. And so the it is wrong to believe solely in the point of view of the person in the machine already, because I argue that that person's conscious mental state is different from the one making the choice. And so, if we were looking at the person who's making the choice, it would be hedonic to actually, in fact, reject this simulated perfect life, knowing that you're choosing, a real life that actually produces pleasure. And that anxiety itself is a sense of displeasure, which further supports the hedonic response to reject it. And for the sadistic crowd, I argue that this is an isolated and superficial objection that defeats only lazy hedonism, because if you think of all the factors, right, this is only isolating the two, groups of people, the one being punished and the people, the sadists, right? But that's isolating the other contextual factors, such as public cruelty, which would distribute pervasive fear. And this would cause a massive hedonic cost, which the objection ignores, and also disregards how the victim's shame trauma are categorically way more severe in quality than the crowd's entertainment, right? And third, the long-term consequences, such as eroded social trust, normalized sadism, are completely dwarf whatever short-term pleasure. And so I think, and I argue that hedonism still rejects this outcome objection. And so the correct conclusion reached by account for all conscious experience is that this practice is wrong, and thus the objection fails. Okay, so here's my bibliography, and I hope this presentation was insightful. Thank you.